Hello, guys, welcome back to the channel YouTube Demystified. And let us continue with our BA Philosophy Honors SEM 3 के course के साथ. And today we will be studying Discipline 9, which is Applied Ethics. Ka first unit, Introduction to Applied Ethics. So this is a book by Peter Singer, and we are reading the introduction part. To an observer of moral philosophy in the 20th century, the most striking development of the past 20 years would not be any advance in our theoretical understanding of the subject, nor would it be the acceptance of any particular ideas about right and wrong. It would rather be the revival of an entire department of the subject, applied ethics. So, moral philosophy का एक ब्रांच जैसे आप समझ सकते हैं अप्लाइड एथिक्स. ओके, सो मॉरल फिलोसोफर के लिए या एक ऑब्जर्वर ऑफ मॉरल फिलोसफी के लिए सबसे स्ट्राइकिंग फीचर 20th सेंचुरी का ये नहीं होगा कि एकदम से कुछ राइट एंड रॉन्ग के आइडियाज़ बिल्कुल बदल गए, ये कि राइट क्या था पहले अब क्या है, या फिर कोई बहुत ही ज़्यादा एडवांस अंडरस्टैंडिंग हमारी सब्जेक्ट में हो गई है, लेकिन एक पूरा रिवाइवल हुआ है अप्लाइड एथिक्स का. आई यूज़ द टर्म रिवाइवल बिकॉज अप्लाइड एथिक्स इज़ नॉट न्यू टू फिलोसफी. The essays in this volume by David Hume, John Stuart Mill fit well alongside modern writings. In the 18th and 19th centuries, these philosophers were doing applied ethics in much the way that it is done today. Indeed, it would have been possible to go further back and include samples of applied ethics from the medieval scholastics or from any of a dozen classical writers. तो यहाँ पर रिवाइवल इसलिए यूज़ हो रहा है ना, वो रिवाइवल बेसिकली इज़ यूज दैट चेंजेस कम्प्लीटली. So there is a thing that has been existed for some time and then there is a revival in it. That means there is like a rebirth of it. Okay, so जैसे कि डेविड ह्यूम, जॉन स्टुअर्ट मिल के हमें बहुत सारे यहाँ पे राइटिंग्स ऐसे मिल जाएंगे इस बुक में. तो इसका मतलब है कि अप्लाइड एथिक्स जो है वो 18th सेंचुरी, 19th सेंचुरी और उसके पहले भी अप्लाइड एथिक्स जो था वो मेडिवल स्कॉलस्टिक्स वगैरह क्लासिकल राइटर्स में भी हमें देखने को मिल जाते हैं इसके एविडेंसेस. तो इट वॉज प्रेवलेंट इवन बिफोर, इट वॉज देयर बिफोर. From Plato onwards, moral philosophers have confronted practical questions including suicide, exposure of infants, treating of women, proper behavior of public officials. The continuity is evident in Hume's discussion of suicide, which draws on Seneca's letter on the same topic, while Thomas Nagel's discussion of death takes up a problem raised by Lucretius. So हम देख रहे हैं कि ethics का जो ये sphere है, इसमें प्लेटो के टाइम से प्रैक्टिकल क्वेश्चंस इन्वॉल्व होना स्टार्ट हो गए हैं. द टॉक्स अबाउट सुसाइड एंड इन्फेंट्स एंड ट्रीटमेंट ऑफ विमेन एंड ऑल ऑफ दीज. तो कहीं ना कहीं एथिक्स हैज़ नाउ कम इन टू द स्फीयर ऑफ प्रैक्टिकल एरेना, एज इन प्रैक्टिसिंग एथिक्स इन एवरी डे लाइफ ऑन डिफरेंट टॉपिक्स. ओके, सो अप्लाइड एथिक्स कहीं ना कहीं हमें प्लेटो के टाइम से एविडेंटली एंड वेरी, अगर हम कहें, ऑर्गेनाइज्ड वे में हमें देखने को मिल जाती है. Christian philosophers like Augustine and Aquinas examined with great care such matters as when a war was just, whether it could ever be right to tell a lie, and if a Christian woman did wrong to commit suicide in order to save herself from rape. So these are all very practical and especially dilemmatic situations. Now, dilemmatic because dilemma is where it's a very, very hard choice, where both the choices are equally correct and we are not able to choose between any one of them. Okay, for example, here it's a very common, it's a very nice example here given here, whether a Christian woman can attempt suicide if she was being raped. So in such a situation, on one side is the safety of the woman. She knows that her body is in danger, she can be raped. On the other side is the choice of suicide. So either she suicides or she can get raped. Now, of course, in Christianity, even in Islam, in most of the religions around the world, suicide is not appropriate. Suicide is strictly forbidden. As in Christian, in Islam, in so many religions around the world, suicide is kind of it's very strictly forbidden and prohibited. So in such a case, whether to save herself, her dignity, her body, or save herself from being exploited, whether committing suicide is right or not, this is a very dilemmatic situation. Hobbes, with the English Civil War freshly in mind, had an urgent practical purpose in writing about the moral basis of obedience to the sovereign. Okay, that whether how much you should be obedient to your sovereign, to the leader of your country, to the ruler of your country. Practical concerns continued with Hume and then with the British utilitarians. Bentham's reforming zeal ranged over an incredible variety of topics, and Mill, in addition to the little known speech on capital punishment included in its volume, wrote celebrated essays on liberty and on the subject of women. So here, what is being trying to what Peter is trying to tell us is that how the applied ethics and the arena of applied ethics have been widely practiced since the times of Plato, and how active the arena of applied ethics had become in things like wars and religion. Everywhere applied ethics was being placed, things were being questioned from an ethical perspective, from an ethical point of view. Despite this long tradition, for most of the present century, moral philosophers kept aloof from practical ethics. A fact that becomes all the more remarkable if we consider the traumatic events through. So, even after this long tradition, that's from such a long time, from the times of Plato, that applied ethics was practiced, most of the present century moral philosopher kept aloof from practical ethics. And through which most of them live. There were one or two notable exceptions. C.A.M. Joad wrote on political and social issues and spoke at the famous 1933 Oxford Union debate when the students voted against fighting for king and country. Bertrand Russell seemed the epitome of a philosopher engaged with the concerns of his times, but his stature among his philosophical colleagues was based on his work in logic and metaphysics, not on his writings on disarmament or sexual morality. So here we see that how they were very in the present century, though applied ethics have been in practice for a very long time, in the present century the philosophers generally were aloof from it. They may have engaged in practical philosophy, but they did not really named it that way. And also those who openly practiced, those who openly engaged in this applied ethics and practical philosophy, their work was not that well considered. For example, here is given that Bertrand Russell, okay, when he engaged with the concerns of his times, he it was that his works on logic and metaphysics were considered more in comparison to his works on disarmament or sexual morality or things like these. That means that somewhere or the other, when he addressed these practical issues, when he addressed these ethical issues, they were not really considered or being brought to light as compared to the other theoretical works. In any case, these few exceptions could not produce a body of writings which could be regarded as a branch of an academic discipline. So there were not enough writings that we can count them under the wing of applied ethics. They were not enough to be counted as a whole discipline. Instead of taking up practical issues, moral philosophers limited themselves to the study of the nature of morality, or in the area of linguistic philosophy, to the study of the meaning of moral judgments. So instead of focusing more on these practical questions, more on these practical issues, the moral philosophers limited themselves to the theory of it. What is morality? What is the nature of morality? What does it mean? What does it not mean? Etc. etc. So instead of really focusing on the practicality of that morality, they focused on the theoretical aspect of the morality. This came to be known as meta-ethics, a term which signified that they were not actually taking part in ethics, but were engaged in a higher level study about ethics. So very simply explained that it was known as meta-ethics. They were not really taking part, but studying at a higher level about what is ethics, what includes in ethics, what is right, what is wrong, everything in that sense. So they were not just bringing them into practice, but basically they were doing everything else with ethics. They were setting standards, evaluating, judging standards, testing standards, everything, but just not bringing them into the arena of practical life. Normative ethics, the study of general theories about what is good and bad, right and wrong, was considered an important part of ethics until the 1930s. Then it too was relegated to a secondary concern, except for occasional discussion of utilitarianism and the different forms it might take. So for some time, what is good, what is bad, these normative ethics. Now this is what is normative ethics, what is normative science, positive science. This is something that we have discussed in detail in the previous videos. In the videos on ethics, what is ethics, introduction to ethics, definition to ethics, and also in the video of what is political philosophy. So in these two videos we have in detail discussed about what is normative science, normative ethics, why it's called normative, why it's called positive, and so on. So that means that somewhere applied ethics was, scaled down to a very small part, to a very limited part, and it was not really much in practice. Ordinary people, and no doubt students beginning their study of the subject, sometimes still harbor the illusion that moral philosophy could be of some use in deciding what we ought to do. So this was like a general notion. This was like a thought that the students or those who started with moral philosophy, they thought that they would have a they have a greater clarity as to what decision should they take in situations. So it was thought that people who would study moral philosophy will have a greater clarity of what is even more morally right and morally wrong as compared to others. Leading philosophers like A.J. Ayer soon put them right. It is silly as well as presumptuous for any one type of philosopher to pose as a champion of virtue. And it is also one reason why many people find moral philosophy an unsatisfactory subject. So these assumptions by the moral philosophers were very quickly dismissed and cleared by A.J. Ayer, who said that it is not possible for any one philosopher or very one type of philosopher. Now, one type of philosopher, that means it can be a political philosopher, a moral philosopher, so different kinds of, a religious philosopher, so many different kinds of philosophers. So it is not possible for one type of philosopher to be highest in virtue. What he is trying to say is that it is not possible that if somebody studies moral philosophy, so that philosopher becomes one of the highest virtue and the champion of virtue, and that person knows what right and wrong will be in any situation. It is not possible. And that is a reason why many people found moral philosophy an unsatisfactory subject, because they would enter into the subject with the goal that they would have greater clarity in the field, they would be a better moral person, but that doesn't happen. So it is unsatisfactory. What it needs to fulfill as a goal is not really being fulfilled by the subject. For they mistakenly look to the moral philosopher for guidance. Yes, they look, means the people, they look towards the moral philosopher to decide what is wrong and what is right in situations, which is not really appropriate, because studying moral philosophy does not necessarily mean that that person will then become a champion of virtues, that that person will suddenly have the knowledge of what is good, what is wrong, what is right, what is bad, everything. C.D. Broad went to the trouble of offering reasons for the received wisdom. It is no part of the professional business of moral philosophers to tell people what they ought or ought not to do. Moral philosophers, as such, have no special information not available to the general public about what is right and what is wrong, nor have they any call to undertake those hortatory functions which are so adequately performed by clergymen, politicians, leaders, writers, etc. So C.D. Broad again explained that moral philosophers don't have a very special information or anything, any special powers, or they're not really specialized into that, or they can't really very concretely decide what is right, what is wrong. It's not that they have a special power or special information after studying the subject. And also, it is not the professional business of a moral philosopher to tell people what should they do or what should they not do. It doesn't really comes under the arena of a moral philosopher to decide and tell people what should be done and what should not be done. So from both the ways, but the philosopher even doesn't have that kind of information, and he should not be engaging this also. It's not the philosopher's business. It may, in part, have been doubts about the adequacy of those whom Broad refers, which induced moral philosophers to take up practical questions. Someone had to be able to do better than the clergy, politicians, and later writers. More importantly, those who nodded assent to views like Ayers and Broad's had not stopped to ask whether moral philosophers could, without merely preaching, make an effective contribution to ethical dilemmas. So even though people who agreed with Ayer and Broad's views that moral philosophers don't really have any special information, they can't really decide what is right and wrong, even they continued asking and wondering the question whether, whether actually can the moral philosophers contribute anything to the ethical dilemmas, like what is wrong, what is right. And sometimes these dilemmas, they're very very serious. There are dilemmas about euthanasia, about animal testing, about abortion. These are some of the, even today, in present times, abortion, or this is one of the biggest ethical dilemmas of the year, of the previous year, I would say. Because you see, it's such an important dilemma. It regards to life and death of something. So these ethical dilemmas, and that is what is the importance of applied ethics in everyday life. Does expertise in moral philosophy equip one to clarify the muddy waters of popular moral debates? Does the knowledge of normative ethical theories make it possible to apply such theories to real ethical problems? Can such an application lead to more defensible positions on these questions? The possibility of an affirmative answer to such questions began to be widely recognized only during the 1960s, when the first American civil rights movement and the Vietnam War and the rise of student activism began to draw philosophers into discussions of moral issues, equality, justice, war, and civil disobedience. So, all these questions that have been asked, that, does knowledge or theoretical knowledge about moral philosophy actually lead to better judgments and better decisions in ethical dilemmas? Can it really clear or give a better answer in ethical situations, which are ethically, which are more right than the other thing? And can it, such it can be really, knowledge of normative ethical theories can really be applied to real practical life situation? Is it possible? So, what happened is that all these questions, the answer to these questions, were then given during the American Civil War and the Vietnam War in the 1960s, when suddenly philosophers became very active. Those who studied moral philosophy, they started discussing about what is equality, what is justice, what is war, civil disobedience, what is ethically right, ethically wrong. Philosophers who entered these debates as concerned citizens gradually realized that they were discussing ethical questions which were part of the philosophical tradition in which they had been educated. So they started with these discussions because of the general issues, but then soon they realized that when they were discussing it, they realized that this is something that they have been studying all along. This is what their ethics, their moral philosophy has taught them to. The skills they had acquired in studying and teaching philosophy was suddenly highly relevant. They were, highly relevant. They were so much, uh, so much more like the present times, and so much more needed in these present situations of war and, civil rights movement and activism, student activism, and such circumstances and conditions. Gradually, the academic world began to respond. Articles on civil disobedience, racial discrimination, war, pacifism began to appear in publications like the Journal of Philosophy. By 1971, sufficient articles in applied ethics had been published for James Rachels to produce an anthology, Moral Problems. At that time, Rachels could still write in his introduction that most students beginning moral philosophy found it disappointingly remote from practical problems, and that if practical problems are mentioned at all, it is only by way of illustrating some more theoretical point. So suddenly, during these times, during the time of the American War, the Vietnam War in the 1960s, that happened. You may have read about this Vietnam War also. So there was a great deal and a wave of all this equality, justice, because this was something, because the Vietnam War was basically fought between, what happened was, it was fought between USSR and the USA during the Cold War times, but it happened on the territory of Vietnam, another country. So this was something very disappointing to the people, that, the war is between two different countries, and then it is happening on a third country, which is destructive for the people there. So this was something really disappointing, and this is ignited and sparked the all the talks about equality and justice, and what the war should do, what are the ethics in war that should be practiced during the war by the countries, and this and that. And suddenly the philosophers, when they discussed about these things, they found themselves that whatever they had studied in morals philosophy until now was becoming very more relevant, much more relevant with the present times, that whatever they're saying, their opinions actually mattered in these times, and they made a they brought a difference. And then there was the Journal of Philosophy, and then James Rachel's wrote the Moral Problems. That means suddenly this morality and this ethics came into light, which is until now very much passive and submissive, and it was lying under the carpet. Now suddenly came out and ignited so many discussions and debates. Also, there was one thing, most of the students still even after all this, the students found that when they studied moral philosophy, they could not really connect it with the times. That means not only the present times, but with the practical real life things, real life situation. And that the students, they would then later realize that the moral philosophy it was studied, it was expected to give something or help for the practical life, but it did not really do that. The moral philosophy, when one student studied it, was very much for theory. And even if the examples of real life problems and practical problems were given in there, this was again to prove a more theoretical point. That means that the moral philosophy was expected to be practical. It was expected that it will teach the people to how to apply it in practical life, but it was far more theoretical. But within 5 years, this was no longer true. The Moral Problems was itself one of the most widely used texts in introductory ethics courses. The founding of Philosophy and Public Affairs, a new journal devoted to the application of philosophy to public issues, provided both a forum and a new standard of rigor for those bringing philosophy to bear on practical problems. So until the 1960s, however it was, whatever it was the same thing, that it was very much pointing to a theory. It was so much theoretical in its approach. But then, suddenly, after all this, when the American War, civil rights, the Vietnam War, all of these started, all of these things brought attention to these ethics and ethical questions and ethical problems. And within 5 years of time, we see a revival of the ethics. We see that there is a change. Now there is being focus on the moral problems. What is that? That there is a problem with moral philosophy, that it is very theoretical, it is not really practical. And we see that there is a change in it, and we see that there is a founding of Philosophy and Public Affairs. It was a new journal which we devoted the application of philosophy to public issues, the real thing that the real motto with which students started studying moral philosophy. That the new journal, Philosophy and Public Affairs, it directed the arena of philosophy towards the public issues. It directed the arena of ethics towards more relevant life problems, practical life problems, and towards more public issues. And it provided a forum and a new standard of rigor for those bringing philosophy to bear on practical problems. The prominence of this journal is indicated by the fact that 3 of the articles in this anthology are drawn from its pages, whereas no other publication is represented more than once. So, the broader community has willingly accepted the relevance and value of contributions by philosophers to practical issues. Perhaps they too have not been entirely satisfied with the performance of the clergy, politicians, and leader writers. So, until now, everything, the task of maintaining the task of ethical decisions, the task of maintaining the ethical character of the society, it was handed over to the clergy, the politicians, the leader writers. The clergy, who were the churchmen. Okay, so what is right, wrong, good, bad, was handed over to either to the rulers or to the clergy. The leaders, the writers, they had this responsibility of maintaining the ethical character. But after this discussion sparked, people started to realize that it was actually the philosophers who did the task for them. And so, who did the task for them. And so we see that it is now the responsibility of the philosopher to maintain the ethical character of the society, and not the clergy, not the politicians, not the leader writers. This acceptance is particularly noticeable in bioethics, where new developments in medicine and the biological sciences throw up ethical questions which have few precedents. So in bioethics, we see the case of euthanasia, we see the case of abortion. In these cases, It was not the politicians or the doctors or the medicine practitioners who were consulted, but also the philosophers who were considered a great deal while making such decisions in bioethics. Thus, it was no surprise when the British government appointed a philosopher, Mary Warnock, to chair its committee of inquiry into human fertilization and embryology. So, you see that how now a philosopher is the one who is trying to engage with the everyday issues and in different spheres. In several countries, philosophers sit on ethics committees in universities, passing judgments on research involving human or animal experimentation. And in some hospitals, they are members of committees which advise on such matters as the withdrawal of treatment from comatose patients. So, as I gave the example of animal testing, of euthanasia, of abortion, these at these places, now the philosophers were the ones who were given an upper hand, who were given a chance to speak and express of what is their thought that what should be done in that situation. In the Australian state of Victoria, there is now even a legislative requirement that medical experiments involving human embryos must be approved by a committee which includes, among other members, a person holding a qualification in the study of philosophy. So now what we see is that the moral philosophy, which was considered highly theoretical in its study, which was expected at first to teach something practical for everyday life but did not do so, now we see that there is such a change. There is like a revival of applied ethics, and the philosopher or somebody who has had a qualification in philosophy now holded a very better position than others, and he or she was thought to be making better ethical decisions than others. Applied ethics has become part of the teaching of most philosophy departments in English speaking universities, taking its place alongside meta ethics and normative ethics. So, now with the theoretical ethics, applied ethics, which is the practical ethics which applies to the practical real life situation, has now become a part of many universities. The climate of political radicalism and student activism from which applied ethics gained so much initial impetus has gone, but applied ethics continues to thrive. So, the reason why applied ethics came back into the sphere, the student activism, that situation of war and civil rights and this and that, has now vanished, has gone. But till today, applied ethics continue to be taught in these universities, continue to be very important arena. This should cause no surprise. It is testimony to the perennial importance of the issues discussed and to the need for them to be discussed with the greatest possible clarity and rigor. Against the long history of philosophical involvement in practical ethical issues, it is the neglect of applied ethics in the earlier years of the century which should be regarded as surprising. So, what is surprising is not how suddenly applied ethics has become so popular, but what should be surprising is that how come applied ethics was ignored all these years before today. The success of applied ethics in establishing itself as a part of the philosophical curriculum has spawned dozens of anthologies, usually arranged so as to cover the major topics which seem relevant and important when the anthology was put together. Often, the articles chosen are selected to provide opposing points of view. For educational purposes, a loosely argued but provocative article may be more effective than one about which students can find nothing to disagree. So, the success of applied ethics in establishing itself as part of the philosophical curriculum has spawned dozens of anthologies, usually arranged so as to cover the major topics which seemed relevant and important when the anthology was put together. So, अप्लाइड एथिक्स का सक्सेस हमें देखने को मिलता है कि उसने कैसे अपने आप को फ़िलासफ़ी का के करिकुलम का एक बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट हिस्सा बना लिया था, और बहुत सारी राइटिंग्स, फ़िलासफ़िकल राइटिंग्स होने लगी थी. एंड how it was a big part of the philosophy curriculum. It was important part, and till date it is important. Till date we study applied ethics as a part of the philosophical curriculum. Often the articles chosen are selected to provide opposing points of view. For educational purposes, this loosely argued but provocative article may be more effective than one without which students can find nothing to disagree. तो जो भी articles produce होते थे applied ethics के sphere में, you would find कि उसके against, उसके opposing हमें बहुत ही strong views मिलते थे. They would spark a lot of debate, क्योंकि applied ethics का arena बहुत ज़्यादा popular था in dilemmas. This collection is intended to serve a different purpose. I have not sought to give expression to alternative viewpoints on each issue, nor did I set out with the intention of covering every major topic, although I did want to show the range of important topics on which work in applied ethics has been done. My primary aim in selecting from the immense body of literature which now exists in this field was simply to take the best. So, in this book, if you see, there are so many different ethical problems and ethical dilemmas, and these were the different writings that were being done in the sphere of applied ethics and in the sphere of philosophy, and they would ignite a lot of debate and discussion, because आप देख सकते हैं कि if you see these topics, you would find very extreme views for these topics. Any choice made on this basis is necessarily highly personal. Moreover, the task of choosing the best is made more complicated by the fact that there is no single quality on the basis of which works of philosophy can be ranked. Nevertheless, I judge each of the articles which follow to excel in at least one, and often all of the following qualities: rigor of argument, originality of ideas, illumination of a significant philosophical question, clarity of presentation, and relevance to an important practical problem. So, यहाँ पे Peter Singer is trying to tell us that the choice of articles that has been done in this book, जो Peter Singer ने जिन articles and जिन writings and anthologies को choose किया है for the topic of applied ethics, वो किन basis पे किया है? For the clarity of presentation, relevance to an important practical problem, significant philosophical question, and everything. The last of these may be considered to be a prerequisite for entry in a collection such as this, that is an important practical problem जो real life में, actual life में, it's a very important and dilemmatic problem, and उसका solution की बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है. So that is one of the most important criteria जिससे कि कोई भी ये articles choose किए गए हैं to include in the book. The last of but in combination with one or more of the other qualities, it can make a marked importance of a topic in all our lives. The more thoroughly it will have been discussed outside philosophy, there is then special merit in adding something new which shifts the discussion to a higher level. I shall not go through each of the articles which follow and explain in just which of these qualities I consider them to excel. But for those seeking examples of the kind of rigorous argument that is so important to the subject, I would recommend David Hume's classic essays on suicide, James Rachel's dissection of the alleged significance of the distinction between active and passive euthanasia, Jonathan Glover's consideration of the tempting thought that it makes no difference whether or not I do it, Derek Parfit's overpopulation and the quality of life, and Janet Radcliffe Richards' separate spheres. Okay, and ये वाले जो कुछ ऐसे topics है, they have really ignited some rigorous arguments. Varied forms of originality are displayed by different articles. The essays on abortion by Judith Jarvis Momsen and by Michael Tuley succeed in dealing in new ways with a topic which might have been thought to be exhausted. The same might be said of Louis Pascal's striking essay on a different but equally well-rehearsed subject. On the other hand, Thomas Nagel, John Harris, Jonathan Glover, Derek Parfit are original in that they find philosophical issues and questions which had previously scarcely been noted. So, ये Jonathan Glover, Derek Parfit, जिन issues के ऊपर लिखा है, these issues were almost neglected before, and today they stand with a very important position in applied ethics. Several of the papers shed light on deeper ethical issues. Nagel, Harris, Glover, Parfit could again serve as examples. So basically what Peter Singer is doing in this portion is he's trying to explain the choice of his articles. He's trying to group the articles. He's trying to tell the characteristics of those articles. And, why are they important and what is their speciality, or why were they chosen in this particular piece. As for relevance to important practical problems, that is, as I have said, satisfied by all those articles which have been included, but we should not take it for granted. Anyone reading Thompson or Tuley on abortion must gain a clearer insight into where the public debate over abortion, which has for so long been fixated on the question of whether the fetus is a human being, has missed the central issues. To provide such an insight is no small achievement. Similarly, while feminist writers have produced many volumes of essays on the position of women, or how many of them have dissected the arguments of their opponents with the care and precision shown in Richard's work. So this is again the same thing. Although applied ethics has now established itself in academia, it still has its critics. So today, applied ethics is a well-established field and a well-established academic discipline in philosophy, but still today, applied ethics is being criticized. Behind much of the criticism lies the belief that is the realm of feeling and emotion. If there can be no objective truth in ethics, it may seem there can be no scope for reason and argument. There can be no scope for reason and argument. The premise is, of course, controversial, but even if we accept it, the conclusion does not follow. So, in general, the articles in this anthology take no stance on the question of the status of ethical judgments. So, basically, the you must have known by now that anthology is what the different philosophical writings, the different writings on the issues of applied ethics, and when they are taken together, it forms an anthology like this one. So this is basically an anthology which is different, writings of different topics of applied ethics. So here Peter says that they're not trying to take any single stance on any of these writings. They're not trying to take a side, but they're just trying to shed light on the topic related to the applied ethics. The authors argue from widely accepted premises, or they seek to persuade by exposing inconsistencies and arbitrary distinctions in opposing positions. Abandoning the idea of objective truth in ethics should not mean abandoning the standards of consistency and relevance we uphold in other aspects of our lives. So, here in certain places, when in applied ethics, the objectivity of truth is let go of. Now, objectivity means we know what is objectivity versus subjectivity. So, when we say that objectivity is being let go of, that does not mean that in every situation all of them are right. That does not mean that we just abandon all these standards that we are using until now. But I shall not go into such theoretical questions now. The articles which follow the best defense to the claim that reason and argument have a role, and they can really bring us closer to a solution to any practical issue and practical problem. So for encouraging me to take on this project, I thank Lyda. Okay, this is so that again.